Visiting Anne Boleyn's grave as Queen Elizabeth I, her daughter. Queen Elizabeth I displayed a curious disinterest in building tombs. Unlike many monarchs who reigned for decades, she never commissioned her own tomb during her lifetime, nor did she fulfill her predecessor Mary I's wishes to be buried alongside Katharine of Aragon, a request outlined in Mary's will that Elizabeth simply ignored. Her brother Edward VI also received no memorial from her, and she left her father Henry VIII's tomb unfinished. Given this pattern, it's not surprising that Elizabeth never relocated her mother, Anne Boleyn, from her modest grave in the chapel floor of St. Peter-ad-Vincula at the Tower of London. Despite her reluctance to openly honour her mother, Elizabeth kept Anne's memory close, and she famously wore a ring with a hidden portrait of Anne inside, and showed her favour to her maternal relatives. Still, Elizabeth was trapped by the complexities of her mother's legacy. Acknowledging Anne Boleyn's innocence would have meant challenging the judicial process that condemned her and questioning the verdict of a jury that included lords still alive during Elizabeth's reign. To do so would have opened a political Pandora's box, one that she wisely chose to avoid. While Elizabeth never provided a grand tomb for Anne, it raises the question, did she ever visit her mother's grave? When Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower during Mary I's reign, it's unlikely that she had the opportunity. Confined either in the bell tower or royal apartments, her movement was strictly limited. Although she may have been permitted short walks around the grounds, these areas did not extend to the chapel where Anne was buried. As Queen, Elizabeth rarely returned to the Tower. She did spend a few days there after her accession in November 1558, following tradition, and again the night before her coronation. However, the Tower's association with imprisonment and death likely kept her away afterwards. There is no record of her visiting the chapel at St. Peter-ad-Vincula, but even if she had, it would have been difficult to do so discreetly. The chapel was far from the royal apartments, and a visit would have drawn the attention of guards, servants, and courtiers, sparking unwanted gossip. Elizabeth, known for her careful image management, would have not risked that. Yet, despite not visiting the grave or building a grand memorial, Elizabeth found other ways to honour Anne's memory. Anne Boleyn's burial site itself was unceremonious. After her execution, her body was left lying on the scaffold. Although King Henry VIII had meticulously planned every detail of her death, from the French executioner to the cloth on the scaffold, no instructions were given regarding her burial. With no coffin prepared, those in charge had to improvise. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, likely took charge, and Anne's body was placed in a wooden chest used for storing bow staves. Stripped of her clothes, which were claimed by the executioner as part of his payment, Anne was hurriedly buried in the chapel with little fanfare or respect. While the events surrounding Anne's death were marked by a lack of care, Elizabeth's quiet reverence for her mother speaks to a more complex relationship, one that, while never fully public, was deeply personal. When Anne Boleyn stepped onto the scaffold, she removed her grey damask gown, revealing a scarlet kirtle underneath. After her execution, it was likely that her ladies-in-waiting, who removed the kirtle to give to the executioner as part of his payment. The garment's size would have been impractical for the makeshift coffin prepared for Anne, a chest that was originally used for storing bow staves. Wrapped in white cerecloth, a burial shroud made from wax-coated fabric, Anne's body was placed inside, her head tucked beneath her arm due to the chest's short length. Anne's remains were carried to the Tower's chapel, St. Peter-ad-Vincula, where a shallow grave was dug to the left of the altar. There she was laid to rest beside her brother George, without any formal funeral rites. Years later, the graves of Catherine Howard, another of Henry VIII's unfortunate wives, and Jane Parker, Anne's sister-in-law, would join hers in this small corner of consecrated ground. By the time of the Victorian era, the chapel had fallen into disrepair. Queen Victoria ordered a restoration, which included exhuming the graves beneath its sunken floor in an effort to identify the long-buried remains. The task proved far more complicated than anticipated, and records showed that the chapel had been used for centuries, not only for prisoners and staff of the tower, but also for local residents. The graves had been disturbed repeatedly, with bones shuffled around to make room for new burials, leading to an unidentifiable tangle of remains. In some cases, coffins had to be deliberately broken, their contents scattered, leaving no way to determine who laid there. Despite the confusion, archaeologists believe they found Anne's remains near the supposed burial site, based on the delicate features of one skeleton. Described in the final report, the bones belonged to a woman of medium height, with a slender neck, rounded chest, and elegant hands and feet. Her skull was well formed, with a broad forehead and a strong, square chin. Some initially doubted the identification due to portraits of Anne showing a more pointed chin, but modern research suggests the Nidhall portrait, which features a fuller face, may be a more accurate likeness. However, the age estimation between 25 and 30 led others to speculate that the remains could belong to Catherine Howard or Jane Parker. The uncertainty remains, as it is possible that the bones belong to none of these women, but rather an unbeknown Tower resident. Not all remains were found. George Boleyn's burial site was never located, and it was speculated that Catherine Howard's young bones, still soft at the time of her death, had decayed to dust, mixed with the soil and lime used at the time. To protect against curiosity and grave robbing, the recovered bones were reburied in secret, and marble markers were placed on the chapel floor to commemorate those that were once interred there. A legend persists that Anne's body was secretly moved to Sale Church near Blickling Hall, the Boleyn family's ancestral home, and buried under a simple black marble slab. Charles Dickens even wrote a fictional account of the secret reburial, but the story is almost certainly fictional. The tower was too heavily guarded for such an exhumation to occur unnoticed, and Anne's family showed little interest in her burial at the time. Thomas Wyatt, a contemporary of Anne, implied that wherever she was laid to rest was a sacred place, suggesting he felt her burial at the Tower was suitable. More recently, there have been claims that Anne's heart was secretly removed and buried at St Mary the Virgin Church in Irwerton, Suffolk. In the 19th century, a small casket believed to contain her heart was found, reviving the local legend. Yet, like the story of her secret reburial, this seems unlikely, as none of the ladies of waiting would have had the emotional or physical capacity to perform such an act after witnessing her execution. There has been some modern interest in exhuming Anne's remains for a more dignified burial, fitting for a former Queen of England. However, given the uncertainties surrounding her burial and the complexities of disturbing historical graves, such an event remains improbable.